Bad Boss Brief, a strategic guide on how to not be an asshole at work. We'll tell you about bad bosses, how they can be handled, how to tell if you happen to be one. An executive and an executive coach, both artists working in advertising and marketing for more than 2 decades, are here to advise you on the ins and outs of office environments. The Bad Boss Brief is your ultimate guide to navigating any employment landscape. Here are your hosts, Eugene S. Robinson and Stephanie Peirolo.
Hey, welcome to the Bad Boss Brief. I am Stephanie Peirolo.
I'm Eugene S. Robinson.
We're glad you're here today. Today, which is our 12th episode, a full dozen, we are going to talk about the cowardly boss.
Not the cowardly lion, the cowardly boss.
Although I think the cowardly lion would be a good little, we try to put little pictures from movies, and I was thinking the cowardly lion is pretty easy. But
I would also dedicate this entire show to Captain Francisco Schettino.
Who is?
Has a fan club. He was Costa Concordia. He was the captain of the ship that he was showing off to his girlfriend while his wife was at home, decided to do some banking turn with his cruise ship and crashed it. As the ship was sinking, he found himself in a lifeboat and went home. They called him at home and they go like, "Where are you?" He goes, "Home." Go, "Get out with the boat." And he was like, "That's just in the movies." He refused and eventually had to do jail time. But to some, he's a hero. A cowardly hero.
Yeah, he would be the patron saint of this episode.
Exactly.
Without any doubt. But before we jump in, I just wanted to say thank you to DNA for hosting us. We did our first Bad Boss Brief live in Seattle on Wednesday, talking about the DEI lie. We did have a couple of sub rosas that came up. And again, the same thing happened. As soon as we finished talking, somebody came up to me and said, "Hey, how about this question that he clearly didn't want to ask in front of the whole group." So
you should note that also the conversation continued. I got waylaid and taken to the Comet Bar down the street, and it continued for at least half an hour at the Comet Bar. So, not to my liking. I was wanting to just have a nice glass of wine. So.
But no. Well, and again, that's why we call it Sub Rosa, because people follow us after an event and want to talk about things. But hey, listen, if you want us to come and talk to you about a thing, about leadership or bad bosses, you can get in touch at WTF@badbossbrief.com or show ideas or questions. So thanks to DNA for hosting us. So let's talk about the cowardly boss. And I was thinking about this because I remembered a story that I was told. So in Seattle, we have earthquakes. They're not as big as the San Francisco, earthquakes that you and I have experienced, but they're pretty good sized. And in February of 2001, Seattle had an earthquake that was 6.8 on the Richter scale. Yeah, and it was a little before 11 o'clock in the morning.
Yes.
So everybody was at work. And I was at work, and I, of course, was in the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. So I knew exactly what was happening, got under a door, braced, was, and everybody's kind of looking around like, what is happening right now? And I'm like, it's an earthquake. Well, a friend later told me that at another agency, which will remain unnamed, there was a leader, and he was pretty senior. I think he was like either the West Coast lead or maybe even a national president of some kind. And they worked in an open office space in a brand new office building. I mean, at the time, that building must have been, I don't know, a year or two old.
Right.
And as soon as that earthquake hit, he fled. He ran as fast as he could, didn't look left or right, may or may not have been shrieking down the emergency stairs.
Schettino.
And she told me later, she was like, my friend just could never think of him in the same way. She just could never think of him. She was like, he just ran past. He didn't think about, let's check on people. He didn't even have that human, like, let me make sure, whatever. He ran in my imagination screaming. And the funny thing was, I could never think of him in the same way either.
Hey, listen, there's a friend of mine who she and her boyfriend are walking through a bad neighborhood, and he's walking really fast. And she's like, "Yo, you want to walk with me? You want to?" He's like, "No, we're in a hurry." And they get stopped and she gets stopped and, engaged with by some, local toughs. And she goes, oh, he go, what are you doing here? He's a bad neighborhood. And she goes, oh, I'm with my boyfriend. And they go, where? And they all look around together, and he's like 10 paces ahead, and he goes, I'm not a boyfriend. Oh, oh,
Wow.
oh, yep, yep. No harm came to either one of them because the thugs thought, I think it was actually said, you've got relationship troubles, and they just laughed and left them.
Wow.
Chilly walk home after that, you know.
No doubt. And probably the
Yeah.
last walk home ever with that
Yes.
particular
Yes.
couple,
Yeah.
as it should
Yep.
be. Well, and I think what's interesting is, I talk a lot about, and we have talked a lot about the impact of fear on leadership.
Mhm.
Right. And it can be really corrosive. And there's been a lot of workplaces that I've walked into as a consultant or a coach and thought you can almost like smell it on people.
Yeah.
You can feel it. Right. However, I do think that at this present moment, having some fear in the workplace, particularly if you work for any of the FANG companies, it's congruent with reality, right? Like if you aren't a little bit nervous walking into work when tens of thousands of people have been laid off at most of those workplaces,
Yep.
you're not really, participating in reality. So fear itself is not the challenge. The challenge is being afraid and not taking appropriate actions because of that fear. And that's why I like to make a distinction because it's funny when we did our Bad Boss Brief Live, I realized that I was presenting in front of a number of people for whom I had done presentation training before in the last like 3 months, right? And so it was like, okay, that's great. But one of the things that I often tell when I do presentation training is that even though I do a lot of presenting, I am a very nervous presenter. Right. I mean, as you know, I could barely choke down like scrambled eggs before the event. You're like hamburger. I'll have some lightly poached eggs, please. And that's because I get really nervous. But I can be afraid and still stand up and dry mouth notwithstanding present or whatever. And that's useful for people who are taking presentation training because they don't assume that, right? You assume that people who get up on stages are never nervous, right? And I do think that it's the same thing. So I want to be clear, like there are leaders who are afraid who can still lead very effectively. Right. And I always think kind of bonus points if you're afraid and do it anyway. The cowards to me are the ones who know what the right action is and they choose not to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. And the most important word I think you just used in that instance was choose, because I do believe in this instance, it is an actual choice.
Right.
And in my experience in life, professional life, as well as personal life, I've found cowards to be one of the more dangerous subspecies of, because one, they'll do almost anything to conceal, like if you read Conrad's Lord Jim, they'll do anything to conceal their cowardly bona fides. And they are dangerous if cornered, similarly. And again, it's really clear. It ties into, I don't know if you had a chance to read my Substack on narcissist, but this is an earmark of narcissistic behavior because, of course, in their world, the guy running out the building is the guy running off the ship. Scatino actually said the ship shifted and he fell into a lifeboat. And so having fallen into a lifeboat, he decided to, take lemons and make lemonade and rode all the way home, So these people are dangerous to other people, always, not sometimes, not never, always dangerous to other people,
Yeah, well, and I read an article in the Harvard Business Review. It's a few years old. It's by this guy, Ron Carucci, who did a big study about cowardly bosses. Yeah. And what he was saying is that it's especially corrosive, right? Because what ends up happening is that one coward really influences everybody else. Yep. Right. And it can really impact. And in fact, he goes so far as to say, if it's not just your leader, if it's the culprit, the corporate culture to be cowardly, you should actually leave. Because it could, you know how I used to work in a coffee shop and the smell of coffee got into my pores and my clothes. It's the same way. The smell of cowardice will overpower you as you just can't get away from it. But what he says, and tell me what you think about this. He says there's 3 reasons that people are cowardly. The first is that they're people pleasing. They want everybody to like them. The second is that they're afraid of failure. And the third is that they don't want to make the hard decisions. And
I think those are secondarily symptomatic I go back to narcissism and kind of real character issues. And it's much the same with lying. There's certain lies that make sense to me. If you prevent someone, you or yourself, from being hurt. Somebody runs up with a gun. Are you Jim? I'm not Jim. You've got a gun. As long as you've got a gun, I'm not Jim. That makes sense to me. That's useful utilitarian cowardice. But the guy walking through the bad neighborhood with his girlfriend, that is, I mean, it's survival cowardice. But in that instance, he has decided that their collective survival is less important than his singular survival. And in a corporation, which is collective action and behaviors, that is just poison. These are secondary things. I mean, this is the way you will know them by their actions. But what drives it is, I think, a fundamental belief that they are more important than everybody else, or a fundamental belief that they are somehow less important than everybody else and don't want to be found out, which sort of ties into, I think, his first one.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. And I think also it can be just fear in general, right? Like they're afraid of everything. Like there's a sort of odd passivity that I've seen where leaders they don't want to make any decision.
Right.
Right. And whatever that may be, maybe it's fear of failure. They're going to do it wrong. Somebody's not going to like them. They won't do anything. They will just refuse to act. And, I mean, I think for me, the challenge is that I've seen this happen where there are things that are illegal that are going on, right? Like I have gone to multiple bosses and said, this is sexual harassment. Right? And it's not even stuff that's happening to me. I've done that also. But, I get much more up in arms if it's something that's happening to women that work for me. I have gone and I have talked about, a hostile work environment towards women. I've talked about a hostile work environment towards Black people and had bosses kind of look at me blankly. Like, well, what do you want me to do? And I'm like, fire his ass. That's what I want you to do. I might not have always said it that way. And they'd take no action.
Well, I used to, my high school job, I was worked in a fast health food restaurant called Dennis's. And at one point, it was right there on 5th Avenue, 18th Street and 5th Avenue near NYU. A woman comes up and she has her plate and she goes, you know what? I had this tomato side dish on the plate. You're using styrofoam plates. I go, okay. And she goes, you may not know this, but I'm a chemist, and I'm telling you, the mixture of some acid in tomatoes mixed with styrofoam causes a poisonous compound. I mean, I know you guys care about that, right? I go, oh my God, thank you. Thank you for telling me. I close the register during a slow point, go back into my manager Howard's office and go tell him the whole story. And he gives me the blank look. And I said, so we should do something about this. He's like, New Yorker, hard, just straight through, goes, what do you want me to do? I got a storeroom of 10,000 of those plates because some broad came in and said she's going to get sick. You want me to throw them out? I go, it's a public service. And he's like, get back to work. I said, like, a cow invariably ends up hurting people, so.
Well, and I think too, when we're talking about, I mean, that is certainly egregious, right? When you're talking about things that people are ingesting, but look at some of the things that have happened at Boeing in my backyard, right? I mean, some of these things, when you're 3M, right? The lawsuits that have been coming up there, when you're talking about chemicals that are going on food or in agriculture that are killing people or causing cancer, when you're talking about making a mistake in an airplane that is being used for commercial flights, then it gets to the place where the cowardly is actually, people will die. And the idea that other people will step around, make excuses, sort of not believe it. That, I think, is what is really scary, is that it's not just having a dysfunctional workplace. If you're talking about, the things that are impacting the public square, then it can be lethal.
Yep. Yeah. And it should surprise no one that the same guy that told me to get back to work in the face of poisonous plates was also a sexual harasser.
Right. Well, and that food service is, that's where mine started. That's where I first got sexually harassed. Yeah. Well, here's a couple of things that if you work for a cowardly boss, here are some suggestions of things that you can do. So
other than fisticuffs.
Well, that wouldn't necessarily be my first take, but yes, if you're like Eugene, other than fisticuffs. So again, this is according to this article from Carucci. Don't emulate, right? What he says is that you need to be particularly careful not to do this, right?
Yeah.
Don't gossip, which is, some would argue, a cowardly action in and of itself. But recognize that this kind of culture spreads. And that's where he makes the point, like, you probably, if it's endemic, you're going to want to get out of this. And then he also says, ask for what you need. And he calls out something that's interesting, is that a lot of times cowardly bosses will not be really good at setting boundaries. And so they will say things like, you know, I have to meet with everybody and everybody comes to me with their problems. And I just, you know, I'm so burnt out because I'm always listening to people's problems, instead of actually setting boundaries. Like, well, why don't you let them, you know, I used to do this thing where I'd be like, okay, you can vent for 5 minutes and then we need to get into suggestions and solutions. So go. And I'd look at my watch, right? That's a boundary. And that's one of the challenges, that a lot of these types of leaders, in their people pleasing, they won't set boundaries with the people around them, right? And then they'll complain and they'll be burnt out. So what he says is, you need to opt right out of that and be really clear about your boundaries, right? I am taking a sick day. I will not be answering email, right? That kind of thing. What were you going to say?
I was just laughing because I had a boss who said, listen, this job is really intense. There's a possibility you can get burned out. If you get burned out, don't do anything weird. I want you to come to me and just, you know, tell me, and we'll work around it, you know? And I go, great. So at one point, after like several 24-hour days and 18-hour days, 7 days a week, I said, hey man, I'm feeling a little burned out now. There's months and months of this, maybe 4 years of this. I feel a little burned out now. He's like, yeah. Anyway, it was so graceful and beautiful how he just slid right by that into something, and not only slid right by it, but I left his office with more work.
No, I believe it. And I think that's another challenge of these, you know, fear-oriented coward bosses.
Right.
Is that they won't listen to that. Right. And I think it's interesting because it's like, you know, and I've also noticed even people who can set boundaries, they have their own hierarchy in their mind. Right. Like it's okay for you to, you know, like, it's okay for you to take a sick day or a mental wellness day, as long as it's only a day. If you actually book 2 weeks of vacation and plan on not checking in, that's a problem, right? That's a problem. Or it might be vice versa. It might be like you can take vacation. And it's often they have their understanding of what it is that they think is good behavior. And I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've heard people complain about people taking their actual accrued vacation. Like she wants 3 weeks off. She's like going to Europe or something. Like, the nerve. What are we supposed to do? It's like, well, don't give people 4 weeks of vacation if you don't want them taking vacation.
Well, also there's a weird thing too, where companies are actively and aggressively encouraging you to take vacation. And in Silicon Valley, that's become shorthand for layoffs, because that's cash in the bank. They have to pay you for your vacation time if they lay you off or fire you. So when companies start saying, look, you guys need to take vacations, or of course it has the counter effect. People like, oh, I've been through this dance before. They're going to have layoffs. I need to bank that vacation time so I can walk out of here with a nice big check when they have the layoffs. So it's weird. The nature of work is in America presently is very strange and almost unhealthy.
Yeah, I would not say almost. I would say it is unqualified. For most people, it is unhealthy. But so here are some other suggestions that I came up with for what you can do if you have this kind of a boss. So I think it's useful to understand what they are being cowardly about. Right. So there's a difference between, you know, somebody who has trouble giving difficult feedback is different than someone who can't fire a person who is sexually harassing multiple women. Right. So it's not all the same, right? I certainly have worked with people who are so conflict avoidant that they can't have difficult conversations with people. It has to go to HR, or often it would come to me, right? But the idea is they're acknowledging there's a problem. It needs to be addressed. If I was in management, it was part of my role. Okay, you know, would rather have the boss do it, but it's not inappropriate for it to come from me or HR. That to me is a lot more forgivable if somebody understands they're conflict averse and has a workaround than somebody who's just like, we're not going to have that conversation. And then I think also try to be strategic about it. If you understand that a boss, like, you know, I have seen circumstances where an individual is very, very reluctant to say anything difficult to another person live. right? But they can sometimes do it in writing. Right. And so it's understand, like, the person that, if you're working for somebody, understand what it is that they are afraid of. And if there is a workaround, if there is something else, you know, and it is frustrating, because I will acknowledge, particularly for women who are dealing with a male leader who is a coward, it essentially, to stay in that circumstance, you need to be doing more emotional overfunctioning than you already are. Right. Which is, you know, we don't need to do all that emotional labor, but if you choose to, if you want to or need to stay in that job, think about the emotional labor of strategically positioning whatever it is that you can do. So, for example, sometimes after I've had situations where somebody will go and exercise, like they'll take a walk at lunch or they'll go to the gym before they come in the morning. That's the time to ask them, because they feel manly and fit, right? That's the thing to ask them to do the hard thing, right? You know, which I hate to have to suggest, but again, the reality is some of us are stuck in jobs we don't like because we need the healthcare and the paycheck. And sometimes we have to work for those kinds of bosses until we can find our way out.
Right. All right. Yeah. Yeah. It's, I mean, it's weird. I went through, and I will name them because it's, why not? When I was looking at the executive editor role at InfoWorld, if that is the name of it. And the publisher at that time was Wonderkin, a young guy, very probably younger than me, and was showing me through the office. And this is before Glassdoor existed. And he didn't seem like a particularly courageous man in my eyes. But walking me through the office, I felt like I was being walked through San Quentin. It was open office, you know, well, actually made it cubicles. And we were walking through, and everybody, it was just, it was horrid stink of fear throughout the whole, and I declined to take the job. I was thinking maybe it's fixable, but you know, but I'm clearly not the guy to fix it. You know, I'm the Vince Lombardi, get out, you know, walk it off type guy. I just can't deal with that kind of, and I'm sure the fear was externally imposed. You know, it matched the tone and timbre of the kind of go tech thing that was going on. Except we're fundamentally editorial people, so we don't have guardrails like you have in engineering, where it's either 2 or it's 4. Yeah, you know, we didn't have that. So yeah, it was a good job not to take. I have not regretted it at all, and I actually became friends with the guy who's taken the job, and he's a pretty placid guy. He's doing a good job, it seems like, but I haven't had the heart to ask him, hey, is your workplace still terribly fear-based? I have not asked him that. So.
Well, and I think that is something that's good to mention when you're looking at workplaces and you're considering, and you get that vibe. And sometimes the way you see that is with the boundary issue, right? Like I remember talking to your friend Carlos Watson, who has, you know, again, you've been writing about, I love the Ulta article, and he was talking to me about taking a full-time role there. And I was like, well, you pretty much demand 24/7, you know, always on. He's like, yeah, I should always be able to get in touch with you. I'm like, even on Sunday mornings? I go to church on Sunday mornings. He's like, well, yeah, even on Sunday mornings. And so the negotiation was that on Easter Sunday, I could go to church and not have to answer his calls until after I got out of church. This is true story, right? So if you have to negotiate to work every Sunday except for Easter, probably a sign that, like I did, to say, yeah, no, that's challenging to me, right? And
I wish they would have arrested him before he told you that, versus like they a couple of months ago. So
yeah, so and I think that is something to keep in mind. And sometimes it can also be, you can get a little cue to it in the actual interview process. Right? Like places that'll have 7, 10, 12 interviews and not tell you why and not give you much guidance. And there's like weeks of quiet time in between. You don't hear anything from them. They're not
Welcome
responding.
to Meta.
Yeah, really.
9 interviews.
I mean, that's just crazy. So one last point before we do Fire Me, and this is something that Karuchi brought up that I thought was really good, is if you are a leader and you want to demonstrate that you are not a coward, be transparent about your decision making, right? So you would say something like this. So telegraph what you're doing. This is a difficult decision. This group of people wants me to take A action. This group of people wants me to take B action. whichever way I go, there's going to be difficulties, right? Telegraph that, make it visible what it is that you are doing, and show that you can have the hard conversations. You can make the difficult decisions, especially if you're trying to turn around a workplace that's had this problems. All right, you have a fire me?
Yeah, well, if you had been at our live event, you would have heard me unload on Mark Zuckerberg, who has turned this this molehill into a mountain of his recent performance in a local jiu-jitsu competition, and what he sort of got his the Meta spokesperson to say he was not choked out. It was a complete non-story that ran into a month because of their constant denials. Well, I come not to bury Caesar in this instance, but to praise him, because today, in a real deft maneuver worthy of Stephen Jobs, he just decided to sidestep all of that. And in an article in Business Insider, I believe, which clearly he said, "Get me a journalist. I want to tell a story." And he's talking about the multiple benefits that come from training jujitsu for CEOs, executive staff members, about learning a certain quality of fearlessness. And he said, it's a sport where when you're a white belt, you're going to get beaten up every day. So he's trying to contextualize his being choked out. I guess he figured, being at loggerheads with the jiu-jitsu community is not a good place to be if you still want to do jiu-jitsu. No matter Dave Camarillo, who's his black belt instructor, who's a hotshot, won't always be there, and you got to get on the mats with people that it's a sport of trust. So I thought it was really clever and deft how he can bull his way through corporate America, through Congress, but what he could not bull his way through was the jiu-jitsu community, the majority of jiu-jitsu players who will get out there and choke you unconscious without a moment's thought, in a sport context. So what he did was to say, look, let's not have that conversation anymore. Let's talk about the fact that this is a sport where everybody who starts at the level where I am is going to get beaten up. So he's sending a message to his board, which is who I think it was initially for. I'm not getting choked out all the time. I can still run the company, and the community that now he's found common cause with. It was pretty clever and deft, and it was what I would have recommended had he come to me the first time. So
well, and it also shows that somewhere in there, I'm guessing there's a decent PR person.
Yes. I'm not going to give him all the credit for this.
Yeah. I mean, somebody who knows what, and the question is why did you not have that person closer in so that it didn't take weeks of foolishness after he lost consciousness in an event, which apparently is a pretty common thing. I wouldn't know, not doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But I think the other thing that's interesting to me is the machismo attitude with this, right? That it's like he's talking about it in a way that's very, it's something a man would say, right? I think that this, I'm doing these difficult things. I mean, there was when I was heavy into advertising and working at different advertising agencies, it seemed like every white guy was doing triathlons. And it was it was a particular era.
Tough Mudder,
where it's like I'm doing triathlons. Look at me doing, all these things. Look at me doing these difficult things. I'm so macho. And the funny thing is, it's like, women just don't roll that way. And it's not that there aren't women who do triathletes. In fact, it was funny. My daughter was comparing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu marks with you before the show. She does this also. So there are certainly women who do those more, those kinds of sports, and yay. But we don't throw down that piece of information as if it is, something about our value. And the reality is, I will say, although I don't know about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, my guess is that a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu match is not as difficult as bringing another human being into the world, right? That's a harder thing. I think if you're going to talk about a kind of test of character, something that proves your mettle, being in labor for, I don't know, in my case, days, does something, right? But women don't brag about that, right? It's not like I had natural childbirth with 6 children, or I had, whatever. Because it's kind of silly, and we see outside of that.
Well, it's also like a checkmate. There's nothing that a guy can respond to with that regard. What are you going to say? I mean, you're the one who contextualized it for me, who said appendicitis was about as bad. I don't know if you remember that.
I
In
do.
1980, when was it? 1990, when I got my appendix out. You said that was the only pain that I had that came close to childbirth. So that gave me some sort of context.
Yes.
So. No, but jujitsu pain is a different type of pain. It's an ego pain, which he now has spent 4 weeks going through. I mean, he put himself in a situation where I couldn't let him call the ref a lie because I train with the ref and know he's not a liar. And everybody in the community knows what happened. So we're not going to protect you from your board. You protect us. You're going to spend your 3 days a week with us. You protect us. Unless you don't want to, and then we don't protect you.
Yeah. All right. On that note, I'm not sure what our next episode is going to be, so send me some suggestions. WTF at badbossbrief.com. That's WTF at badbossbrief.com. And we'll see you in a couple weeks. Take care. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Bad Boss Brief with your hosts, Eugene S. Robinson and Stephanie Peirolo. You can check out more of their work by visiting consigliera.substack.com for Stephanie and eugenesrobinson.substack.com for Eugene. You can also find Eugene at Mr. Sleep 3, that's the number 3, on Instagram. Send us your questions or comments to WTF@badbossbrief.com. And be sure to join us right here on your favorite podcast platform for more insights every other week. Until next time, don't be an asshole at work.